Wyoming Territory, 1882. The wind howled low through the cottonwoods as Florence Mayfield stood alone on the edge of Cheyenne's train depot, her gloved hands resting over the soft swell of her belly. Snow flurried down in slow spirals. Her wedding dress, now wrinkled and dull after 2 days of dirt and rail smoke, hung heavy around her ankles. She had not eaten since yesterday morning. Her her former fiancé had made sure of that when he left her standing in the grand parlor of his family's Denver estate, her suitcase beside her, his words cold and final. "I will not marry a woman carrying a child that is not worthy of the Brantley name." The child was his. And he knew it. Florence blinked hard against the sting in her eyes. She had believed in him. All his promises, his letters, the way he had touched her hand like it mattered. Now her ring finger was bare and red, her future gone like smoke. She had nowhere to go and no one left to write to. The depot cleared out as the last train hissed and rolled out eastward. She stayed. The cold clawed at her bones. Just as she started to lower herself to the bench, her knees threatening to buckle, a voice called out from behind. "You lost, miss." She turned. The man in front of her was lean but broad in the shoulders, wearing a wool coat dusted with snow and a hat low over his brow. His hair was dark, his jaw rough with a few days' stubble. His eyes quiet and steady were the kind of brown that held stories. "I do not have anywhere to go," Florence said, voice thin. He looked her over, not rudely, just taking her in. "You look like you need a place to sit before you fall over." She nodded. He held out a hand. "Rhett Bramble, Florence Mayfield." He did not ask why a woman in a wedding gown with no luggage was standing alone at a train depot. He just helped her sit, then took off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. "I have a cabin about 20 minutes out," Rhett said after a while. "There's stew on the stove and a fire still warm. You look like you need both." Florence hesitated. "I will not touch you," he added simply. "I got a spare room and a horse that does not mind company." Her fingers curled around the coat. Her child shifted inside her, a slow reminder that she was not just deciding for herself anymore. "I would be grateful," she whispered. The cabin sat tucked between pines, smoke curling from the chimney. Inside was warmth, real warmth. A fire crackled low and the smell of beef and potatoes wrapped around her like a blanket. "You can wash up through there," Rhett said, pointing toward the back. "I will get your plate ready." She nodded and stepped into the washroom. When she returned, the dress was gone, replaced by one of his shirts and a wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders. He had not asked her name again. He had not asked anything. They ate in silence. She was halfway through her stew before she realized how hungry she had been. "You from Denver?" he finally asked. She nodded. He did not push further, just leaned back in his chair and sipped his coffee, watching the fire. "I was supposed to be married," she said after a long time. He looked over at her. "He left me, said people like me ruin names like his." "But the child is his." Rhett's jaw ticked, but he said nothing right away. Then, quietly, "That child did not ask to be born with a name or without one." She blinked, stunned by the simplicity of it. "I can pay for the food," she said quickly, feeling heat crawl up her neck. "I have a few coins and a ring. I will find a boarding house once you are not going anywhere tonight," Rhett cut in gently. "You are cold, tired, and carrying a child. That is enough reason to stay." She looked down at her hands. "Besides," he said softly now, "my mother always said this house was too quiet anyway." The next morning, snow blanketed the fields. Florence woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of Rhett chopping wood outside. She watched him from the window. His coat was off, sleeves rolled up, movements steady. Each swing of the axe was clean. There was something peaceful about him. Like he had nothing to prove to anyone. When he came back in, cheeks flushed from the cold, Florence was stirring the oats on the stove. "You did not have to," he said. "You took me in, I can stir oats." He smiled, just a little. "Fair enough." They ate together again. Then he saddled his horse and hitched up the wagon. "I am heading into town. I can pick up a few things if you need." She hesitated, then reached out. "Could you get me some cloth for sewing?" "I want to make something for the baby," he nodded. "I will be back before dark." The days turned to a week. Florence stayed. She took over the kitchen, kept the hearth lit, and mended old curtains. Rhett never asked her to, she just needed to do something with her hands. He worked the land outside, brought in firewood, taught her how to gather eggs from the coop without scaring the hens. At night they sat by the fire. Sometimes they talked, sometimes they did not. "You never asked me what I planned to do," she said one night. Rhett looked over from the chair. "That is your story to tell, not mine to pry," she swallowed. "I do not have much left, but I want this child to know peace and kindness," he nodded. "That is all I want too." It was late January when her back seized up and she cried out from the kitchen floor. Rhett ran in. "I am fine," she insisted. "You are not." He carried her to the bed, his hands gentle but sure. She clutched his shirt as another pain rolled through her. "It is too early," she breathed. "No," he said, brushing hair from her face. "It is time." He stayed with her through every hour. Boiled water, held her hand, whispered steady words even when she screamed, and when the baby finally cried, Rhett caught her in his arms. "She is perfect," he whispered. Florence sobbed. "A girl," he nodded. "Strong lungs too," she named her Tessa. Rhett built a cradle by hand. He did not ask. He just carved it from pine, sanded it smooth, and set it beside her bed. At night, he would rock it gently with his foot while reading aloud from old books. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Florence walked out onto the porch, baby in her arms. Rhett was fixing the fence. "She likes the sound of your voice," Florence said. He looked up. "I do too." He froze, gaze caught in hers, then he stepped closer. "Florence." She reached for his hand. "You have done more for me than anyone ever has. You saw me when I was broken. And you never turned away." He took the baby from her, cradled Tessa like he had done it 1,000 times. "You both belong here," he said. Florence stepped into his arms, and for the first time in months she felt whole. By the second thaw, the earth had begun to soften, and Rhett's land stirred with the first quiet signals of spring. The creek just beyond the tree line ran faster now, carrying away the last of the ice. Florence stood near the stoop, Tessa nestled in a sling against her chest, her eyes fixed on the rows of furrows Rhett had begun carving through the soil with his plow. He worked shirt-sleeved today, the early sun glancing off his shoulders, his hands sure on the reins. The field was still rough with frost underneath, but he worked like it was already May. She didn't call out, just watched, pressing her lips against the warm crown of her daughter's head while her thoughts ran ahead of her. Later, Rhett came in with dirt clinging to his boots and the creases of his hands. He stepped quietly, always careful not to wake the baby. Florence had just finished boiling water and was pouring it over strips of cloth she'd cut from an old flour sack. "You're bleeding your knuckles again," she said, not looking up. He glanced down, then shrugged. "Handle got splintered. I'll file it down tomorrow." She reached for a clean towel and dipped it in the hot water, then came around the table. He held still as she pressed the cloth to his hand. "You don't have to do that," he muttered, voice low. "I know," she answered. Rhett didn't pull away. His fingers curled slightly under hers, but he didn't say anything more. The silence wasn't heavy, just full. Florence didn't ask about the planting or the fence rails he'd tell her when he wanted to. Instead, she folded his hand gently in the towel and said, "I've been thinking about what to do with the old shed." He tilted his head. "I want to turn it into a room for sewing," she went on. "Someplace with good light. I could trade work for the mercantile men's shirts, maybe make linens." He nodded slowly. "That'd be good. You'd have to patch the roof. That corner leaks when it rains. I'll need tar paper. I'll get it next time I go into town." She looked up at him then. "You don't have to keep doing things for me, Rhett." "I know," he said, eyes steady on hers. "But I want to." That evening, Tessa fussed with a restlessness that didn't ease, not with rocking or milk or lullabies. Florence carried her through the cabin, her back aching with the rhythm. Rhett came in from brushing down the horse and took the child from her without a word. He paced the length of the room, murmuring something she couldn't quite hear. Tessa quieted gradually, her small cheek pressed against the crook of his arm. In the lantern light, Rhett's face was softer than she'd ever seen it, his mouth relaxed, brow smooth. Florence leaned against the doorway, arms crossed over her chest. "She only quiets like that with you lately," she said. "She knows I'm not going to drop her," he said, glancing her way. "Besides, I think she likes listening to the wind in the trees, makes her feel like she's still inside you." Florence blinked. That's a strange thing to say for a man who's never had a child. He looked at her then, long and thoughtful. You hear things different when you spend most of your life listening to what isn't said. She stepped forward slowly. And what do you hear from me? His thumb brushed over Tessa's back. You're trying not to hope too much. I reckon you don't think you're allowed to. She didn't answer. Just reached up and took her daughter from his arms, holding her close. That night, as she lay in bed with Tessa beside her, Florence stared at the ceiling and thought about the way Rhett had held her child. Not as if she were someone else's, as if she were his. Morning brought a gray chill and a sky that promised rain. Rhett was already outside, hammering new shingles into the shed roof. Florence carried a basket of fresh washed linens to the line, her boots sinking slightly into the softened ground. Mrs. Keene stopped by late in the afternoon, bundled in her shawl, her buggy pulled up at the edge of the gate. She was a widow from the next property over and had known Rhett since he was a boy. I came to bring you these, she said, handing Florence a small parcel wrapped in oilcloth. Baby gowns I made for my firstborn. I never had the heart to give them away, but I think now it's time. Florence took the bundle, fingers trembling. Thank you. Mrs. Keene's eyes, sharp and kind, swept over her. You've done something good to him. I haven't seen Rhett smile so easy since before his brother died. Florence's breath caught. He never told me. He wouldn't, the older woman said. But I thought you ought to know. Caleb was younger. Fever took him fast. Rhett tried to ride for the doctor in a snowstorm, but it was too late. She didn't stay long after that. Florence stood on the porch a while, the parcel in her arms, watching Rhett at the far edge of the field as he bent to check the furrows. He didn't see her, but she saw him, and something inside her settled. When he finally came in that evening, damp from the sudden rain, Florence met him at the door. I want to stay, she said. He stilled, hands dripping onto the floorboards. I mean for good, she added, her voice low. Not just until spring. Rhett looked at her, long and quiet. I was hoping you would, he said, but I didn't want to ask. She stepped forward, reached for the edge of his sleeve, and held it. You didn't have to. The first Sunday of April brought a break in the sky, pale blue stretching clean and wide above the hills. Rhett tied down the last of the seed sacks in the barn while Florence stood on the back stoop, brushing out her hair in the breeze. Tessa dozed in the sling at her chest, her small hand curled against the fabric of her mother's dress. Wind's easing up, Rhett called as he stepped out. You feel like walking? Florence looked down at her boots, still damp from yesterday's thaw. How far? Just past the ridge. There's a stand of aspen I want to show you. They're white as bone this time of year. Good place to breathe. Florence shifted Tessa gently, adjusting the sling. I'd like that. They left the cabin behind, following the wagon path until it split into a narrow trail. Rhett carried a knapsack over one shoulder, though she hadn't seen him pack it. The ground was soft beneath their steps, and the hush of the woods around them made each bird call sound like it had weight. After a while, she said, You always walk this way alone. Not since my father passed. He used to bring me out here when the fields got to feeling too tight. What'd he talk about? Mostly nothing. He'd point out trees he remembered from when he was young. Once said God carved the rivers first so men would know where to rest. She smiled faintly. My mother used to say God gave women babies so they'd always have something to hold when the world turned cruel. He didn't answer, but his eyes softened. When they reached the clearing, the trees opened into a quiet grove, their trunks pale and smooth, reaching skyward like columns in a forgotten church. Rhett spread a blanket on the dry grass and sat down with his knees drawn up. Florence settled beside him, easing Tessa into her lap. He reached into the knapsack and pulled out a small jar. Inside were slivers of honeycomb floating in amber. Mrs. Keene gave me this last fall, he said. Told me not to waste it on biscuits. Florence laughed under her breath. What else would you put it on? He unscrewed the lid and held it out. Try it with your finger. She dipped her fingertip into the honey and brought it to her mouth. The sweetness bloomed slow, warm, and rich. For a moment she closed her eyes. You ever think about what you'd do if none of this had happened? Rhett asked. I used to, she said. Most days I imagined a house with wide windows and blue curtains, no staff. Just me and a garden and someone who didn't care how much silver my family owned. He looked at her, quiet for a moment. You ever imagine who that someone was? Not until lately. Tessa stirred, blinking up at the sky, and Florence adjusted her shawl to shield her from the light. You'd have made a fine schoolteacher, Rhett said. You've got that way about you, gentle but steady. My uncle wanted me to become one, sent me to a boarding school in Philadelphia to train. I only lasted a year. Why? They told me I asked too many questions. Rhett chuckled once, low in his chest. That's a shame, you ask good ones. She looked down at Tessa, who had drifted back to sleep. I think she'll ask plenty. I want her to. I want her to know her thoughts matter. She will, Rhett said. Not just because you'll teach her, but because she'll see it in how you live. Florence's fingers brushed the edge of the blanket. That's something I'm still learning. He reached for her hand, not quick, just steady. When his fingers closed around hers, she didn't pull away. They stayed like that while the light shifted around them. The trees swayed with the breeze, and a hawk passed overhead, its shadow gliding across the grass. By the time they started back, Tessa was awake and blinking quietly from the sling. Rhett walked a little closer now, his hand brushing her back each time the trail narrowed. At the cabin, Florence stepped inside first, setting Tessa down in the cradle. Rhett stayed near the door, watching her. I've been thinking about the room behind the kitchen, he said after a moment. It's not much, but if I fixed the beams and ran a flue, it'd stay warm enough come winter. She turned from the cradle, brushing her hands on her skirt. What for? For you and Tessa. If you wanted space of your own. Florence studied him. What if I don't want space from you? His throat worked once before he spoke. Then I'd be grateful. She stepped across the floor, slow but not uncertain. You've seen all my truth, Rhett Bramble, every bit of it. He met her eyes. And I still want more. She reached up, her palm resting against his chest. I want to build a life here, with you. He covered her hand with his own. Then let's do it, day by day. Outside, the wind shifted again, pushing the scent of thawed earth through the open window. Inside, everything settled. By late May, Rhett had added a porch swing to the front of the cabin. He'd hung it from the rafters with hemp rope the color of dry wheat, and the wood still held the scent of fresh pine. Florence sat there now, one foot resting lightly on the floor, coaxing a gentle sway. Tessa was tucked against her chest, wrapped in muslin, her breathing soft, and even Rhett came up the path from the barn, a rolled bundle under his arm. Took some asking around in town, but I found you a bolt of cotton muslin, cream-colored. Said it'd be easier on your eyes for sewing. Florence looked up from her stitching frame. You walked to 3 stores for that. 4, he said, setting the bundle on the bench beside her. The mercantile didn't have any left. One of the freight clerks remembered a shipment that hadn't sold last spring. She ran her fingers along the fabric. This'll hold shape well. I can make a christening gown from it. He leaned against the porch post, arms crossed. You want to have Reverend Greeley come out, she nodded. If he'll ride this far, I don't need a crowd, just someone to speak her name over the land. I'll ride into town tomorrow, ask him myself. Florence folded the muslin and set it in her lap. You always find a way to give without making it feel like a debt. Rhett shifted his weight. You've never asked for anything but honesty. That night, after Tessa had been laid down and the fire burned low, Florence cleared 2 plates from the table and set a small tin box beside Rhett's elbow. He paused mid-reach. What's that? My mother's brooch. The only thing I kept from her when I left Denver. She opened the lid, revealing a small oval clasp, the gold dulled by time, but the enamel still bright with blue forget-me-nots. She wore it on her wedding day. Said it reminded her that love was a promise, not a performance. Rhett looked at her, quiet. I want you to hold on to it, she said. Not because I need you to give it back, but because I'd rather it sit in this house, in this life, than locked in a trunk full of grief. He closed the box carefully and set it aside without comment. The next morning brought a knock at the door just after sunup. Rhett opened it to find Reverend Greeley, his coat dusted with pollen and his boots travel-worn. Word reached me you'd asked for a naming, he said. Didn't feel right waiting till Sunday. Florence stepped forward, hair still damp from the basin, her hands smoothing the folds of a soft linen dress. We're glad you came. They gathered beneath the cottonwood by the creek, Tessa bundled in the gown Florence had stitched the night before. The water moved slow and steady, a hush between them and the hills beyond. Reverend Greeley spoke gently, his voice roughened by years of wind. "In the presence of this land and the company of those who keep you, I name you Tessa Mayfield Bramble," Florence's breath caught. She hadn't spoken the second name aloud before. Rhett didn't flinch. He reached for her hand and held it without looking down. Afterward, the Reverend stayed for coffee and left without asking questions, only tipping his hat and saying, "You've built something worth keeping." That evening, Florence found Rhett sitting just outside the barn, polishing a bridle. The sun had dipped behind the ridge and the light left a golden ring along the tops of the grass. "I didn't expect you to accept that name," she said. He didn't look up. "I didn't think I had to. It fit. She's not your blood. That never mattered to me." She stood still for a long moment. "When I first came here, I was surviving. That's all I knew how to do. I didn't think I had room for anything else." He set the bridle down, brushing his hands clean. "And now I think this place might be the first thing I've ever chosen." He stood slowly, closing the distance between them without force, just a quiet certainty in his step. "Then stay, Florence, not because you have to, not because it's easier than leaving. Stay because you want to wake up beside me when the roof creaks and the fire's gone out." She reached for his hand. "I want you beside me when she takes her first steps, when she falls and needs someone steady, and when she's old enough to ask why I stayed." He tilted his forehead to hers. "We'll show her." Above them, the stars slipped into the sky one by one. No promises were spoken beyond that, because none were needed. The truth of their choice lived in the hush between words, in the weight of a shared life that had already begun. July came in dry and steady, the grass along the fence line curling at the edges, and the creek running low and clear over its stones. Rhett had finished laying the last of the fence posts along the western edge of the property, and Florence had begun trading lace-edged handkerchiefs and stitched cradle slips at the dry goods store in town. They had not spoken of marriage, but the rhythm of life had folded them into each other without ceremony or need for declaration. That morning, Florence stepped out of the cabin just as Rhett returned from checking the trap lines. He carried a small bundle of pelts wrapped in canvas and a letter, the envelope marked with Denver ink and a heavy seal. She met his eyes. From them, he handed it to her wordlessly. Florence took it inside, opened it with the tip of the kitchen shears, and stood at the table reading while Tessa cooed from her rug near the hearth. The letter was brief. Her uncle had passed away in spring. The estate had gone to a cousin she barely remembered. There was no provision left for her, nor any mention of Tessa. She folded the letter once, twice, and dropped it in the stove. Rhett leaned in the doorway, arms crossed. "You all right?" "I feel nothing," she said. "Is that wrong?" "No," he said. "Some ties rot long before they break." That evening, she brought down a folded piece of paper from the chest beneath the bed. She laid it in front of Rhett by lamplight, an old contract, drawn up before she left Denver, for a parcel of land her mother had purchased under Florence's name. It was modest, the size of a garden now overgrown with time, but hers by law. "I thought I'd sell it," she said. "But maybe it's better left. I could ask the county to transfer it to your name." He didn't touch the paper. "I'd rather you kept it." "Give it to her someday." Florence looked toward the cradle. "You think she'll want it? She'll want to know where she came from, even if it's not where she belongs." They said nothing more that night, but something shifted between them, quiet, sure. The following week, Rhett built a small gate between the barn and the growing patch of squash Florence had planted. It was nothing more than rough cedar slats and a swing latch, but it marked something. When he finished, he found her behind the house, hanging herbs to dry beneath the eaves. "I've been thinking," he said, brushing dust from his sleeves, "about the way my father used to say land meant more when it had your name on it." She turned from the string of sage. "I suppose that's true. I want yours on this land, not just in the county book." "In the name?" She stepped down from the stool, her skirts grazing the dirt. "Are you asking me what I think you're asking? I'm not a man for fine words," he said. "But I know what I want beside me when the years get lean. I want you. I want her." I want to call this ours and mean it in every way. Florence didn't answer. She stepped close, lifted his hand, and laid it against her heart. You've had this from the start, she said. You just never took it. They were married the next Sunday with Reverend Greeley under the same cottonwood where Tessa had been named. No guests, just Mrs. Keene standing beside them with a ribbon in her hat and a tin of molasses cookies wrapped in cloth. Florence wore a dress she'd sewn from faded blue lawn, and Rhett had cleaned his boots until the leather shone like river stone. Tessa sat in her basket, waving her fists at the sky, a crown of wildflowers tucked around her head. After the vows, Florence leaned close and whispered something in Rhett's ear that made him close his eyes for a long moment before pressing his forehead to hers. No one asked what she'd said. The seasons turned. By the following spring, the shed had become a proper workshop, with a wide window and shelves lined with cloth and thread. Florence had begun taking in orders from the ranchers' wives up toward Rawlins, her needlework known now for its precision and care. Rhett added a lean-to the barn and brought in 2 milk cows, their warm breath rising in the morning mist. Tessa began walking that march wobbly at first, then with growing certainty, her arms often outstretched toward the porch where Rhett stood waiting to lift her high above his shoulders. One night, as they sat beneath the stars with the door open behind them and the sound of frogs in the creek, Florence leaned into Rhett's side and said, "She'll never know the world I came from. She'll know the one we built." Florence rested her head against his shoulder. "I used to think love was a thing someone gave you when they decided you'd earned it. And now I know it's something you build with your hands and keep warm with your back when the wind comes down." Rhett turned, his mouth brushing her forehead. "I'll keep it warm as long as I've breath in me," and he did. Years passed. The garden grew. The fences held. Tessa learned to read by the hearth and ride a horse before she lost her first tooth. The cabin never emptied. It only filled slow, deep, and quiet with the kind of love that asks for nothing more than to be held and handed forward. Florence never left the land again, and neither did Rhett. They lived long. They lived full, and they lived together always.